Sometimes the people we walk past every day carry stories we'll never know. Sometimes those stories can save a life. Kenneth Bowen was just a janitor at Riverside Community College, pushing his mop down empty hallways after everyone else went home. Students barely noticed him. Professors didn't know his name. He kept his head down and his past buried where it belonged. But one quiet evening, a young woman approached him with tears streaming down her face. Her voice broke as she spoke. "Please, they beat my mom. She's dying." Most people would freeze or run for help. Kenneth didn't. He dropped his mop and followed her without hesitation. What he did next shocked everyone who witnessed it, because this quiet janitor had a secret, one he'd hidden for 8 years. What could make a man walk away from saving lives? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Riverside Community College hummed their familiar evening song as Kenneth Bowen guided his cleaning cart down the 3rd-floor corridor. It was 8:30, and the building had emptied an hour ago, leaving behind only the scattered evidence of another day. Crumpled papers near the trash bins, coffee rings on tables, the faint smell of dry erase markers lingering in the air. This was Kenneth's world now, and he'd made peace with it. Or at least, that's what he told himself every night when he clocked in. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he worked. Mop, rinse, ring. The rhythm had become meditative over the past 8 years. Each stroke across the linoleum was a small act of order imposed on chaos, a task with clear boundaries and visible results. Unlike the life he'd left behind, where outcomes were uncertain and the stakes were measured in heartbeats and breaths, Kenneth was 52 years old, though most people guessed he was older. His hair had gone almost entirely grey, and the lines around his eyes spoke of years spent squinting into harsh sunlight and harsher realities. He stood just under 6 feet tall, with a lean frame that still carried the posture of military training, even if he tried to slouch it away. His hands were what gave him away to anyone who bothered to look closely, steady, precise, with calluses in places that didn't come from pushing a mop. His apartment was a 15-minute walk from the campus, a modest one-bedroom in a quiet building where the neighbors kept to themselves. That suited Kenneth fine. The space was sparse, a futon that served as his bed, a small table with one chair, a television he rarely turned on. The kitchen was clean because he barely used it, subsisting mostly on sandwiches and instant coffee. There were no photographs on the walls, no personal touches that might invite questions or memories. In the bedroom closet, pushed to the very back behind his few changes of clothes, sat a shoebox. Inside that box, wrapped carefully in cloth, was a combat medic badge and a collection of medals he hadn't looked at in years. "Evening. Kenneth." The voice came from behind him. Familiar and warm, Kenneth turned to see Virgil Washington, the evening security guard, making his rounds. Virgil was in his mid-60s, a retired postal worker who'd taken the security job to stay active and social. He was one of the few people at the college who consistently acknowledged Kenneth's existence. "Evening, Virgil," Kenneth replied, his voice quiet but steady. "Quiet night." "Same as always. Found a couple of kids trying to sneak into the library after hours, but they scattered when they saw me." Virgil chuckled, shaking his head. "Not sure what kind of trouble they thought they'd get into surrounded by books, but I suppose that's youth for you." Kenneth managed a small smile. Virgil had been trying to draw him into conversation for years now, and Kenneth had become skilled at the art of appearing engaged while revealing nothing. It wasn't that he disliked Virgil, quite the opposite. The man reminded him of the better parts of military camaraderie, the easy companionship of people who understood the value of showing up and doing the work. But friendship meant questions, and questions led to places Kenneth couldn't go. "You take care now," Virgil said, continuing his patrol. "Don't work too hard." "Never do," Kenneth said, though they both knew it was a lie. Kenneth's work areas were always immaculate, his attention to detail bordering on obsessive. It was another remnant of his former life, the understanding that details mattered, that small oversights could cascade into disasters. After Virgil disappeared around the corner, Kenneth returned to his work. He moved through the English department wing, emptying trash bins and wiping down surfaces. Through the office window of Professor Althea Drummond, he could see her still at her desk, despite the late hour, surrounded by stacks of student papers. She was in her late 40s, with kind eyes and a reputation for actually caring about her students. Once she'd caught Kenneth's eye and waved, then brought him a cup of coffee without asking if he wanted it. He'd been so surprised by the gesture that he'd mumbled something awkward and barely thanked her. She just smiled and said, "We all need a little kindness sometimes." He hadn't known what to do with that kindness, so he'd filed it away with all the other small gestures he didn't deserve. Kenneth's thoughts drifted as he worked, which was dangerous. When his mind wandered, it inevitably found its way back to the same place, to 12 years of service as an army combat medic, to field hospitals in places whose names he'd never forget, to the weight of other people's lives balanced on his decisions. He'd been good at it, better than good. His commanding officers had told him he had a gift, an instinct that couldn't be taught. He could walk into chaos and find the thread of what needed to happen first, second, third. His hands never shook, even when the situation screamed for panic, but that was before the phone call that came while he was deployed in a desert half a world away. Before the words "accident" and "didn't survive" and "I'm so sorry" became the only words that mattered. His wife, Sandra, his daughter, who'd been 7 years old and learning to ride a bike, gone in an instant because a drunk driver had run a red light on a Tuesday afternoon. Kenneth had been saving strangers when his own family died. He'd been so good at keeping other people alive that he'd somehow believed his competence created a shield around the people he loved. The universe had corrected that arrogance swiftly and completely. When he'd returned stateside for the funeral, something inside him had broken in a way that couldn't be fixed. He'd finished his enlistment because he didn't know what else to do, but every patient he treated felt like an accusation. Why did they get to live when his family didn't? Why was he still good at this when being good at it hadn't mattered when it counted? So he'd left. Walked away from commendations and career advancement and a pension that would have been comfortable. He'd found this job, this quiet place where nobody knew him and nobody needed him to be anything more than competent with a mop. It wasn't healing, he understood that much, but it was survivable, and for a long time that had been enough. Dean Prescott sometimes crossed his path during evening events. The dean was a man in his 50s, professionally cordial but always slightly distracted, the way administrators often were when dealing with people they considered part of the infrastructure rather than the community. Kenneth preferred it that way. Invisibility was a skill he'd cultivated carefully. The clock on the wall showed 9:15. Kenneth finished the 3rd floor and moved his cart toward the elevator, already planning his route through the 2nd floor. The building settled around him, creaking and sighing the way old buildings do when they think no one's listening. This was his favorite time, when the space was entirely his, when he could move through it like a ghost, leaving order in his wake and asking nothing in return. He didn't know that tonight would be different. Didn't know that in less than an hour, a young woman with terror in her eyes would find him, and the careful walls he'd built around his old life would begin to crumble. Didn't know that the skills he'd tried to bury would claw their way back to the surface, or that the person he'd been trying to forget was about to become the person he needed to be. For now, Kenneth just pushed his cart, mopped his floors, and existed in the quiet. Space between who he'd been and who he'd become. A space that was about to collapse. Entirely, Kenneth was wiping down the water. Fountain on the 2nd floor when he heard the sound, footsteps rapid and uneven echoing up the stairwell. His body registered the urgency before his mind caught up, muscles tensing in that old, familiar way. He straightened, setting down his cloth, and turned toward the stairwell door just as it burst open. A young woman stumbled through, her face streaked with tears, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked around wildly, spotted Kenneth, and rushed toward him with the desperation of someone who'd run out of options. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, you have to help. They beat my mom. She's dying." Kenneth's entire world shifted in that moment. The janitor's uniform, the mop, the careful distance he'd maintained, all of it fell away like a costume he'd been wearing. His voice, when it came, was different, calm, steady, authoritative. "How long ago?" he asked, already moving toward her. "I don't know, maybe 20 minutes. I found her on the floor. There was so much blood. The woman's hands were shaking violently. The ambulance? They said 20 minutes, maybe more. We're outside town limits and—" "Where is she?" Kenneth interrupted gently but firmly. "My car. I drove here because it was closest and I didn't know what to do. Show me." Kenneth was already walking toward the stairs, his mind clicking through protocols he hadn't used in years. The woman followed, nearly tripping in her haste. They took the stairs quickly, Kenneth's questions coming in rapid succession. "Is she conscious? Is she breathing? Where's the blood coming from?" "Her head, I think." "And her side?" "She was conscious when I left, but barely. She kept saying my name." The woman's voice cracked. "I shouldn't have left her alone, but I didn't know what else to do." "You did the right thing," Kenneth said, as they burst through the main doors into the parking lot. "What's your name?" "Adrian. Adrian Foster." "I'm Kenneth. Your mother's going to be okay, Adrian. Just stay with me." The confidence in his voice was remarkable, even to him. He hadn't felt it in years, that absolute certainty that he knew what needed to happen. But it was there, rising up from wherever he'd buried it, taking control. Adrian's car was parked haphazardly near the entrance, driver's door still open. Kenneth could see from 20 feet away that this was going to be bad. He'd seen enough trauma in his life to recognize the signs, the awkward position of the victim, the stillness that suggested consciousness slipping away. "Get in the driver's seat," he told Adrian. "Start the car, but don't move until I tell you. And call 911 back. Tell them we're bringing the patient to them. Get a location where we can meet the ambulance." Adrian's address was in a rural area about 10 minutes northeast of campus. Kenneth did the math instantly. If the ambulance was coming from the hospital in town, meeting them halfway could save 5 crucial minutes. He opened the passenger door and found Lorraine Foster slumped against the seat, her breathing shallow and labored. She was 62, Kenneth guessed, with grey hair matted with blood on the left side. Her face was pale, lips beginning to show cyanosis, not enough oxygen. A makeshift compress, probably a kitchen towel, was pressed against her abdomen, soaked through with blood. Kenneth's hands moved before his conscious mind gave permission. He checked her carotid pulse, weak but present, around 110 beats per minute. Tachycardia compensating for blood loss. He gently tilted her head back, opening her airway. Her breathing improved slightly but remained shallow. "Lorraine," he said clearly. "Can you hear me?" "I'm Kenneth. I'm going to help you." Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Not good but not the worst he'd seen. "Adrian, where's that ambulance location?" "They said—" Adrian's voice was steadier now, focusing on the task, helping her manage the terror. "They said Route 47 near the old Miller farm. They're 7 minutes out from there. We're going. Drive fast but smooth. No sudden stops or turns. Go." As Adrian pulled out of the parking lot, Kenneth worked with practiced efficiency in the cramped space. He removed the soaked towel from Lorraine's abdomen, quickly assessed the wound, a deep laceration, possibly from a kick or blunt impact, bleeding steadily but not arterially. He grabbed a clean jacket from the back seat, folded it, and applied firm, direct pressure. With his free hand, he checked the head wound. Significant laceration above the left ear, swelling already pronounced. Possible skull fracture. He'd need to monitor for signs of increased intracranial pressure, but right now, the immediate threat was shock from blood loss. "Adrian, you have any water bottles in here?" "Glove compartment." Kenneth retrieved one, opened it with his teeth, and brought it to Lorraine's lips. "Lorraine, I need you to try to drink. Just a little." Her eyes opened slightly. "I'm Kenneth." "You're safe. Your daughter's here. We're getting you help." He managed to get a few drops of water past her lips, enough to assess her swallow reflex. "Still functional." "You're doing great." Stay with me. The drive felt endless and instantaneous simultaneously. Kenneth's training had taught him to exist in a strange state during trauma care, hyper-aware of every second while somehow existing outside of time. His hands maintained steady pressure on the abdominal wound, while his eyes continuously assessed Lorraine's condition. Color, breathing rate, level of consciousness. Every few seconds he spoke to her, keeping her engaged, keeping her fighting. Tell me about yourself, Lorraine. You live alone? A weak nod. Not anymore, Kenneth said firmly. After tonight, Adrienne's not letting you out of her sight. Isn't that right, Adrienne? Never, Adrienne said from the front seat, her voice thick with tears but steady on the road. See? You've got people who love you. That's worth sticking around for. Lorraine's eyes focused on him for a moment, and something like recognition passed through them. Not of Kenneth specifically, but of what he was. Someone who knew what they were doing. Someone who'd done this before. Her hand, cold and trembling, found his and squeezed weakly. There you go, Kenneth said softly. You're a fighter. I can tell. The ambulance lights appeared ahead, brilliant in the darkness. Adrienne pulled over, and Kenneth was out of the car before it fully stopped. The paramedics, a man and woman in their 30s, rushed over with their equipment. Single patient, 62-year-old female, victim of assault, Kenneth reported immediately, his voice crisp and professional. Head trauma with significant laceration, left temporal region, possible skull fracture. Abdominal laceration, moderate blood loss, showing signs of compensatory shock. Pulse 110, respirations shallow at 22 per minute. She's been in and out of consciousness. Airway is patent. I've maintained pressure on the abdominal wound for the past 8 minutes. The male paramedic stared at him. Who are you? Someone who knows what they're doing. She needs fluids and fast transport. The head injury is my primary concern. Watch for Cushing's triad. The paramedics moved into action, their training overriding their confusion. They had Lorraine on the gurney in seconds. IV line started, oxygen mask in place. The female paramedic looked at Kenneth with new respect. You medical? Was, Kenneth said simply. Well, you probably saved her life. This kind of blood loss, 10 more minutes. She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Adrienne stood beside Kenneth, watching as they loaded her mother into the ambulance. She was shaking, the adrenaline finally catching up with her. Kenneth turned to her, his voice gentle again. She's going to make it, Adrienne. You got help in time. Because of you. Adrienne looked at him with something between gratitude and confusion. Who are you? You're not just a janitor. Kenneth felt the walls he'd built threatening to collapse. This was the moment he'd avoided for 8 years. The moment when his past and present collided. When people started asking questions he couldn't answer. I'm just someone who was here when you needed help, he said quietly. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't enough. Knew that what had happened tonight had changed something fundamental. The skills he'd tried to bury had saved a life, and there was no taking that back. The ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing, and Kenneth stood in the darkness with a young woman who just watched him become someone else entirely. His uniform was covered in blood. His hands, steady throughout the crisis, had begun to tremble slightly now that it was over. Thank you, Adrienne whispered. Thank you so much, Kenneth nodded, unable to trust his voice. Because gratitude was the one thing he'd never learned how to accept, not when he carried the weight of the lives he hadn't saved. Come on, he finally said. I'll drive you to the hospital. As they got into the car, Kenneth caught a glimpse of himself in the side mirror. A man covered in someone else's blood, looking more alive than he had in years. And that terrified him more than anything. Kenneth didn't sleep that night. He sat in his apartment as dawn broke, still wearing his blood-stained uniform, staring at nothing. The adrenaline had long since faded, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. He'd crossed a line he'd sworn never to cross again, and there was no going back. By the time he showered and changed into clean clothes, his phone had already started ringing. The college. He let it go to voicemail, then listened to Dean Prescott's message asking him to come in for a meeting. The tone was formal but not unkind. Kenneth understood what that meant. Word had spread. He arrived at campus just after 9 in the morning, having not slept in over 24 hours. The moment he walked through the main entrance, he felt the change. Students he'd passed invisibly for years now turned to look. A few whispered to each other. One young woman smiled and nodded at him with something like respect in her eyes. Kenneth kept his head down and made his way to the administrative offices. Dean Prescott's secretary, a woman named Harriet, who'd never so much as acknowledged his existence before, stood up when he entered. "Mr. Bowen, please go right in. The dean is expecting you, Mr. Bowen, not just the janitor or a simple gesture toward the office." He'd become a person overnight. Dean Prescott rose from behind his desk as Kenneth entered, extending his hand. Kenneth shook it, confused by the formality. "Kenneth, please sit down." The dean gestured to one of the leather chairs across from his desk. "I heard about what happened last night, how you helped that young woman and her mother. I just did what anyone would do," Kenneth said quietly, the lie automatic. "That's not what the paramedics said. They told the police you provided field trauma care that likely saved Lorraine Foster's life." Prescott leaned forward, his expression earnest. "They said you worked like a trained professional, because you are one, aren't you?" Kenneth said nothing, which was answer enough. "I pulled your employment file this morning," Prescott continued. "Your application was pretty sparse, just the basics. No detailed work history. At the time, we were short-staffed and you seemed reliable, so we didn't press. But now I'm curious. What's your background, Kenneth? Does it matter?" Kenneth's voice was carefully neutral. "I do my job well. Always have. It matters because we have an opportunity here." Prescott sat back in his chair. "The college has been discussing expanding our campus safety program. Basic first aid training for staff, better emergency response protocols. With your background you could—" "No." The word came out harder than Kenneth intended. "Sir, with respect, I'm a janitor. That's all I want to be." Prescott studied him for a long moment. "Why would someone with medical training choose to push a mop?" "Because I couldn't save the people who mattered most. Because every patient I treated became a reminder of my failure. Because this job asks nothing of me except to show up and clean, and that's all I can handle. Personal reasons," Kenneth said aloud. The dean nodded slowly. "I understand privacy, Kenneth. But what you did last night, people are talking. The local news has already called asking for information. Adrienne Foster's been trying to reach you. You're going to have a hard time staying invisible now." Kenneth felt something cold settle in his chest. The news, of course. A human interest story. Janitor saves life. They dig into his background, find his military service, maybe even find out about Sandra and his daughter. His carefully constructed walls were crumbling faster than he could shore them up. "I'd like to return to work," Kenneth said, standing. "If that's all right." Prescott sighed but nodded. "Your shift doesn't start until this evening. Take the day, Kenneth. You've earned it. And think about what I said. We could use someone like you in a more visible role." Kenneth left the office, feeling like the building was closing in around him. He made it halfway across the quad before a voice called out, "Excuse me, are you Kenneth Bowen?" He turned to find a woman in her 40s approaching, notepad in hand, camera hanging around her neck. His heart sank. "My name is Beatrice Shaw. I'm a reporter with the Riverside Gazette. I'd love to talk to you about what happened last night." "No comment," Kenneth said, turning away. "Just 5 minutes. The community wants to know about the hero who—" "I'm not a hero. Please leave me alone." He walked faster, but Beatrice kept pace. "Mr. Bowen, you saved a woman's life. That's newsworthy. People are inspired by—" Kenneth stopped and turned to face her. "I did what needed to be done. That's all. I don't want attention. I don't want recognition. I just want to be left alone to do my job. Please respect that." Beatrice's expression softened slightly, but her professional instincts won out. "I understand you value your privacy, but this story is going to be told with or without your cooperation. Wouldn't you rather have some control over the narrative?" "Write whatever you want," Kenneth said tiredly. "Just leave me out of it." He walked away before she could respond, heading off campus toward his apartment. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize. It was Adrienne. "My mom is stable." They say she's going to recover fully because of how quickly she got treatment. I can never thank you enough. Please, let me know if there's anything I can do. She wants to meet you when she's able. Kenneth stared at the message for a long time. Part of him wanted to respond, to check on Lorraine's condition, to ensure the treatment plan was appropriate. The medical instincts he'd buried were stirring, whispering questions about her care that he had no business asking. He turned off his phone without responding. The next morning, the newspaper arrived. Kenneth had cancelled his subscription years ago, but someone, probably Virgil, had left a copy outside his apartment door. The headline made his stomach drop. Mystery Janitor Saves Life, Campus Custodian's Hidden Medical Skills, Shock Community. Below it was a photo, his employee ID picture from the college, grainy but recognizable. The article detailed what had happened, included quotes from the paramedics, mentioned that Kenneth had declined to comment. It described him as humble and reluctant hero, phrases that made him feel sick. Worse, the article mentioned that records showed Kenneth had served in the U.S. Army, but that details of his service were unavailable. Beatrice Shaw had done her homework. When Kenneth arrived for his shift that evening, everything had changed. Students smiled at him in the hallways. A professor he'd never spoken to stopped to shake his hand. Even Virgil, who usually kept their interactions brief and friendly, pulled him aside. "Saw the paper," Virgil said. "Army medic, huh? Why didn't you ever say anything?" "Didn't seem relevant," Kenneth said. "Man saves a life and doesn't think it's relevant." Virgil shook his head with a slight smile. "You're a piece of work, Kenneth, but I respect it. Just know, if you ever want to talk, I'm around." Kenneth nodded, grateful that Virgil wasn't pushing, but not everyone was so understanding of his desire for privacy. Throughout the evening, students approached him with questions, gratitude, curiosity. By the time he reached the third floor, Kenneth's nerves were frayed. He just wanted to work, to disappear back into the rhythm that had sustained him for 8 years. He was cleaning the water fountain, the same one he'd been working on when Adrienne found him, when he saw Professor Althea Drummond approaching from her office. She carried 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," she said, offering him one. "It's been quite a couple of days for you." Kenneth accepted the coffee because refusing would have been rude. "Thank you. I've been teaching here for 15 years, Althea said, leaning against the wall. "You've been here for 8 of them. I've watched you work, watched you avoid people, watched you carry something heavy. I never pried because everyone deserves their privacy. But I want you to know what you did was remarkable. And if the attention is difficult, I understand. Sometimes being seen is harder than being invisible." Kenneth looked at her, surprised by her perception. "It is," he admitted quietly. "Well, for what it's worth, I've always seen you, not just as the man who keeps our floors clean, but as someone who clearly understands the value of showing up and doing good work, even when no one's watching. That takes character," she smiled gently. "The rest of the campus is just catching up to what some of us already knew." After she left, Kenneth stood alone in the hallway, coffee in hand, feeling something shift inside him. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of years spent hiding. But for just a moment, being seen didn't feel quite as terrifying as it had that morning. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Adrienne. "I know you want privacy. I respect that. But my mom keeps asking about you. She wants to say thank you in person. No pressure, but if you could visit even for 5 minutes, it would mean the world to her." Kenneth stood there for a long time, holding his phone, staring at the message. The smart thing would be to decline, to maintain his boundaries, to protect the life he'd built. But Lorraine Foster had looked at him in that car, had trusted him with her life. And he'd made her a promise in that moment, even if he hadn't spoken it aloud, that she would be okay. He typed a response. Before he could talk himself out of it, "I'll come by tomorrow afternoon." As soon as he hit send, Kenneth felt the walls around his carefully controlled life crack just a little bit wider. The hospital smelled exactly as Kenneth remembered, antiseptic and floor wax with an underlying note of anxiety. He stood in the parking lot for 5 full minutes before forcing himself through the entrance. He'd avoided hospitals since leaving the military, avoided anything that might pull him back into the world of medicine and all the memories that came with it. Lorraine Foster was in room 314. Kenneth found it easily, his feet remembering the rhythm of hospital hallways even after 8 years away. He paused outside the door, hearing voices within. Adrienne talking to her mother, their conversations soft and punctuated by occasional laughter. The sound of it, that easy intimacy between mother and daughter, hit him harder than he'd expected. He knocked gently. "Come in," Adrienne called. Kenneth entered to find Lorraine propped up in bed, her head bandaged, but her color much improved from the last time he'd seen her. The monitors beside her bed showed stable vitals, heart rate in the low 70s, oxygen saturation at 98%. His eyes catalogued these details automatically, old habits reasserting themselves. "Kenneth," Lorraine said, her voice warm despite its weakness. "Come here. Let me look at the man who saved my life." He approached the bed, uncomfortable with the gratitude in her eyes. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Foster?" "Like I got kicked by a mule, but alive to complain about it." She reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "The doctors said if I'd lost much more blood, or if that head injury had gone untreated any longer, I might not have made it. You gave me back my life, Kenneth. I just did what needed to be done. That's what Adrienne said you'd say." Lorraine smiled, and Kenneth could see the sharp intelligence in her eyes, the kind that came from decades of reading people. "Sit down, please. You look like you're ready to bolt." Kenneth sat in the chair beside the bed, aware of Adrienne watching him from the corner of the room. She looked different in daylight, less frantic. A woman in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back, wearing jeans and a sweater that suggested she'd been at the hospital all night. "The police came by this morning," Lorraine said, "asking questions about the attack. I couldn't tell them much. 2 men, I think, maybe 3. They broke in while I was making dinner. I heard the door smash, turned around and—" She paused, the memory clearly painful. Everything happened so fast. "They wanted money, jewelry. When I said I didn't have much, one of them hit me. After that, it's all fragments until I woke up here." "Did you see their faces?" Kenneth asked, his tone professional despite himself. "No, they wore masks. Dark clothes. That's all I remember before." She touched her bandaged head gently. Kenneth nodded, already thinking through the attack pattern, the level of violence. Something about it felt wrong, excessive for a simple robbery, but he pushed the thought away. Not his concern anymore. "Well, I'm glad you're recovering," he said, starting to stand. "I should let you rest." "Wait." Lorraine's hand found his again. "Tell me about yourself, Kenneth. Adrienne says you're a janitor at the college, but the paramedics told the police you worked like a trained combat medic." Kenneth felt his walls going up automatically. "That was a long time ago. Not so long that you've forgotten." Lorraine's voice was gentle but persistent. "A skill like that doesn't just disappear. Why hide it?" He should have deflected, should have made an excuse and left. But something in Lorraine's directness, her refusal to let him retreat, made him pause. Maybe it was because she'd trusted him with her life. Maybe it was because sitting in this hospital room, he felt more like his old self than he had in years. "I was an army medic for 12 years, he said quietly. "Left 8 years ago, came here. That's all there is to it." "That's not all," Adrienne said from her corner. Kenneth had almost forgotten she was there. "I looked you up. After that night, I needed to know who you were. There are records, commendations, news articles about medical personnel serving in field hospitals. Your name came up. You saved a lot of lives over there." Kenneth's jaw tightened. "You had no right—" "You're right, I didn't." Adrienne moved closer, her expression apologetic but determined. "But I'm a freelance journalist, Kenneth. Research is what I do. And when someone with your credentials is working as a janitor, avoiding any kind of recognition, there's a story there." "There's no story," Kenneth said, standing now. "Just a man who wants to be left alone." "Kenneth." Lorraine's voice cut through the tension. "Sit down, please." He did, though every instinct told him to leave. "I lost my husband 5 years ago," Lorraine said. "A heart attack, sudden, no warning. One day he was here, the next he wasn't. For a long time, I couldn't function. Couldn't see the point of getting up in the morning. Adrienne practically had to drag me back to life. She glanced at her daughter with affection. What I'm saying is I recognize someone carrying grief. It's in your eyes, Kenneth. In the way you hold yourself apart from the world. Kenneth said nothing. What could he say? That she was right? That he'd been carrying his dead family with him for 8 years? Letting their loss define every choice he made? I'm not trying to pry, Lorraine continued. Whatever happened to you, whatever made you leave medicine, that's your business. But I will say this, you have a gift. What you did for me, the way you knew exactly what to do without hesitation, that's not common. And gifts like that shouldn't be wasted. They're not wasted, Kenneth said, his voice tight. I use them when I need to, like the other night. But you could use them every day, Adrienne said. You could help people, train others, make a real difference. I made a difference once. The words came out harder than Kenneth intended. I was good at what I did. Really good. And you know what that got me? He stood abruptly. Nothing. When it mattered most, all that skill, all that training, it meant nothing. The room fell silent. Kenneth realized his hands were shaking, that he'd revealed more than he'd intended. He took a breath, trying to regain his composure. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I shouldn't have. You lost someone, Lorraine said. And it wasn't a question. Kenneth met her eyes and saw only compassion there. No pity. Somehow that made it worse. My wife and daughter, he said, the words feeling like glass in his throat. 8 years ago, I was deployed. There was an accident. By the time I got home, they were already. He couldn't finish the sentence. Adrienne's expression shifted from curiosity to understanding. Oh, Kenneth, so you see, Mrs. Foster, I did make a difference. Just not for the people who mattered. He moved toward the door. I'm glad you're recovering. I really am. But I can't be what you want me to be. I can't be that person anymore. He was in the hallway before either of them could respond, walking fast, needing air, needing space. But he'd only made it to the elevator when a familiar voice stopped him. Kenneth Bowen. As I live and breathe, he turned to find a woman in her mid-50s approaching, wearing a white coat with a hospital ID badge. It took him a moment to place her, then recognition hit like a punch. Dr. Price, he said. Geneva Price had worked at the military hospital where Kenneth served during his last deployment. She'd been tough, brilliant, and one of the few doctors who'd treated the medics as equals rather than subordinates. Kenneth hadn't seen her since he'd processed out of the army. I heard through the grapevine that someone matching your description saved a woman's life using field trauma protocols, Geneva said, studying him carefully. When I saw the name in the admission records, I had to check for myself. What are you doing here, Kenneth? And why are you working as a janitor? It's a long story. I've got time. Geneva gestured toward a small consultation room off the main corridor. Come on, we need to talk. Kenneth wanted to refuse, wanted to get as far from this hospital and these questions as possible. But Geneva had that same quality Lorraine did, a directness that made deflection feel dishonest. 5 minutes, he said. In the consultation room, Geneva closed the door and leaned against the desk, arms crossed. Talk to me, Kenneth. Last I heard, you were being fast-tracked for advanced training. Command wanted you in a teaching role. Then you just disappeared. What happened? My family died while I was deployed. I couldn't do the work anymore after that. Geneva's expression softened. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. She was quiet for a moment, then said, But Kenneth, you're still doing the work. That woman upstairs is alive because you couldn't turn off what you are. A healer doesn't stop being a healer just because they put down their tools. A healer who couldn't save his own family isn't much of a healer. That's grief talking, not logic. Geneva moved closer, her voice firm but kind. You know as well as I do that medicine isn't magic. We can't save everyone. We can't always save the people we love. That doesn't make us failures. It makes us human. Kenneth shook his head. You don't understand. Then help me understand. Because from where I'm standing, I see someone with extraordinary skills working a job that uses maybe 5% of their potential. And I see someone who, when faced with an emergency, couldn't help but step up and save a life. That tells me you're not done with medicine. You're just running from it. The words hit too close to home. Kenneth moved toward the door. I need to go. Kenneth, wait. Geneva pulled a card from her pocket. I run a clinic at the VA hospital 2 days a week. We're always short on staff, and we see a lot of veterans who are struggling with exactly what you're struggling with. The aftermath of service, the difficulty of transitioning back. If you ever change your mind, if you ever want to use those skills again, call me. Kenneth took the card without looking at it. I won't. Maybe not today, Geneva said. But keep it anyway. As Kenneth left the hospital, card burning in his pocket, he felt the careful structure of his life continuing to crumble. Too many people were seeing him now, asking questions, expecting things. The invisibility that had protected him was gone, and he had no idea how to get it back. 2 weeks passed, and Kenneth discovered that resistance was futile. Despite his best efforts to retreat back into anonymity, the world kept pulling him forward. Adrienne appeared at the college almost daily, always with some excuse, bringing him coffee, updating him on her mother's recovery, asking casual questions that felt less casual with each visit. You don't have to keep checking on me, Kenneth told her one evening as she found him in the library. Restocking supplies? I'm not checking on you, Adrienne said, handing him a cup of coffee exactly how he liked it, black, no sugar. She'd noticed after the second visit. I'm visiting a friend. We're not friends. Not yet, she agreed cheerfully. But we're getting there. My mum wants to invite you to dinner this weekend. She's been home for a week now, getting stronger every day, and she'd really like to thank you properly. Kenneth's first instinct was to refuse, but something stopped him. Maybe the memory of Lorraine's perceptive eyes, or maybe just the bone-deep loneliness he'd been ignoring for 8 years. What time? He heard himself ask. Adrienne's smile was genuine and warm. Saturday, 6 o'clock. I'll text you the address. Saturday arrived before Kenneth could talk himself out of it. He stood on the porch of a modest, single-story house in a quiet neighborhood, holding a bottle of wine he'd agonized over at the store for 20 minutes. Before he could knock, the door opened. Kenneth! Lorraine greeted him with a smile, looking remarkably healthy, aside from the healing scar above her left ear. Come in, come in. You're right on time. The house was warm and lived in, with photographs covering nearly every surface. Lorraine and her late husband. Adrienne at various ages, family gatherings that spoke of a life well lived. Kenneth felt like an intruder in this space full of memories and belonging. Dinner was simple, but good. Roasted chicken, vegetables, homemade bread. Kenneth couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten a meal someone else had prepared with care. The conversation flowed easier than he'd expected, helped by Lorraine's gift for drawing people out without making them feel interrogated. Adrienne tells me you've been at the college for 8 years, Lorraine said, passing him the bread basket. That's a long time to stay in one place. It suits me, Kenneth said. Quiet, predictable, lonely, Lorraine added gently. Kenneth didn't argue. There was no point denying what she could clearly see. You know what I've learned, Lorraine continued. After my husband died, I spent 2 years avoiding everything that reminded me of him. Packed away his clothes, stopped going to the places we'd gone together. I thought I was protecting myself from pain. She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. But I was really just avoiding living. The pain was still there. I just added loneliness on top of it. Mom, Adrienne said quietly, a gentle warning. I'm not prying, sweetheart. Just sharing. Lorraine looked at Kenneth with that same direct gaze he remembered from the hospital. Eventually I realized that remembering my husband, keeping his memory alive, that didn't hurt more. It actually hurt less because I was honoring what we had instead of trying to pretend it never existed. Kenneth set down his fork, his appetite suddenly gone. It's not the same thing, isn't it? Lorraine's voice remained gentle. Grief is grief, Kenneth. The details are different, but the weight of it, that's universal. You had time, Kenneth said, the words coming out rougher than he intended. Your husband lived a full life. You had years together, memories to sustain you. My daughter was 7 years old. She never got to... His voice broke. She never got to grow up. And my wife, we were supposed to have decades, not just... He stood abruptly, needing space, needing air. I'm sorry. I can't... Kenneth, wait, Adrienne said. But he was already heading for the door. He made it to the porch before Lorraine's voice stopped him. "I won't pretend to understand your pain," she called from the doorway. "Losing a child, there's no comparison, no way to make that better. But I do know that they wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life hiding from it. From yourself." Kenneth turned to look at her, this woman he'd saved, who somehow seemed to understand him better after 2 conversations than most people had in years. "How do you know what they'd want?" he asked. "Because you loved them," Lorraine said simply. "And people who are loved want the people they leave behind to keep living. Really living, not just existing." Kenneth couldn't find words to respond. He nodded once, then walked to his car, leaving behind the warmth of that house and the uncomfortable truth of Lorraine's words. That night, he couldn't sleep. He stood in his apartment, looking at the bare walls, the impersonal space he'd created. Then, for the first time in 8 years, he opened his closet and pulled out the shoebox from the back. Inside, wrapped in cloth, were his medals: Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Army Commendation Medal. Beneath them, a small frame containing a photo he hadn't looked at since he'd packed it away. Sandra and his daughter, taken on a beach vacation when she was 5. Both of them smiling at the camera, sunlight in their hair, joy in their eyes. Kenneth sat on the floor with the photo in his hands and let himself remember. Not just the pain of losing them, but the gift of having had them at all. Sandra's laugh, his daughter's questions about everything, the ordinary moments he'd taken for granted, bedtime stories, Sunday morning pancakes, the way Sandra would kiss his forehead before he left for deployment. He wept for the first time since their funeral, and when the tears finally stopped, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, not peace. Exactly, but perhaps the beginning of it. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it didn't feel quite as crushing as it had before. The next morning, Kenneth placed the photo on his nightstand. It was a small act, but it felt monumental. At work that evening, he found Virgil in the security office, reviewing the day's incident reports. "Can I ask you something?" Kenneth said. "Sure thing," Virgil replied, looking up with interest. "When you lost someone..." Kenneth paused, then continued. "You wear a wedding ring, but I've never heard you mention a wife." Virgil glanced at his hand, at the worn gold band. "Lost her 6 years ago. Cancer. How did you..." Kenneth struggled with the question. "How did you keep going?" Virgil was quiet for a moment, considering. "I didn't at first. Thought about joining her, if I'm being honest. But then I realized she'd spent her last months fighting to stay alive, fighting to have just one more day. Seemed disrespectful to waste the days I had left." He met Kenneth's eyes. "So I decided to live enough for both of us. Do the things she didn't get to do. Help people when I could. Make my time matter. Is it enough?" Kenneth asked. "Does it fill the space they left?" "Nothing fills that space," Virgil said honestly. "But over time you learn to live around it. And eventually you find new reasons to keep waking up." He paused. "Why are you asking, Kenneth?" "Because I'm tired," Kenneth admitted. "Tired of hiding? Tired of being half alive?" "Then stop," Virgil said simply. "I see the way people look at you now after what you did. You've got a chance to step back into the world. Might be scary, but living scared is still living." Kenneth nodded slowly. "There's a woman, Dr. Price. She offered me part-time work at the VA clinic. I told her no. Maybe it's time to tell her yes." That night, Kenneth pulled Geneva's card from the drawer where he'd buried it. He stared at it for a long time, feeling the weight of the decision. Going back to medicine, even part-time, meant opening himself up to everything he'd been avoiding: the responsibility, the risk of failure, the possibility of loss, but it also meant using the gifts he'd been given, honoring the training he'd received, making his time matter, as Virgil had said. He picked up his phone and typed out a message before he could second-guess himself. "Dr. Price, this is Kenneth Bowen. If the offer still stands, I'd like to talk about the VA clinic position." The response came within minutes. "Kenneth, the offer absolutely still stands. Can you meet me at the clinic tomorrow at 2? We'll talk details." "I'm glad you reached out." Kenneth set down his phone, his heart pounding. He'd just taken the first real step forward in 8 years, and it terrified him. But underneath the fear was something else, a faint spark of purpose he'd thought was extinguished forever. He looked at the photo on his nightstand, at Sandra's smile, at his daughter's joy. "I'm trying," he whispered to them. "I'm finally trying." The next afternoon, Kenneth met Geneva at the VA clinic. The facility was smaller than the military hospital where they'd worked together, but it had the same feeling, a place dedicated to healing, to service, to taking care of people who'd sacrificed for others. Geneva showed him around, introduced him to the staff, explained the clinic's mission. They treated veterans struggling with physical injuries, mental health challenges, the difficult transition to civilian life. Many of them, Geneva explained, felt invisible in the larger healthcare system. "We need someone who understands what they've been through," Geneva said. "Someone who can relate to their experiences." "You'd be perfect for this, Kenneth." "I'm not a doctor," Kenneth said. "I can provide basic medical care, but you're a combat medic with 12 years of experience. You're more qualified than half the people working in civilian clinics." Geneva stopped walking and faced him. "But more than that, you understand what it's like to come home changed, to struggle with what you've seen and done. These veterans, they need someone who gets it." Kenneth thought about the patients he'd see here, the lives he might impact. Then he thought about the life he'd been living, the isolation, the waste of his skills, the slow erosion of everything that had once defined him. 2 days a week to start, Geneva said. "Wednesday and Friday afternoons. We'll ease you back in." "All right," Kenneth said. "I'll do it." Geneva's smile was worth the fear churning in his gut. "Welcome back, Kenneth. You've been missed." As he left the clinic, Kenneth felt the world shifting beneath his feet. He was no longer just a janitor hiding from his past. He was becoming something more, something that still scared him, but something that felt right in a way nothing had for years. His phone buzzed. A text from Adrienne. "Mom wants to know if you're free for dinner next Saturday. No pressure, just family, food, and hopefully easier conversation than last time." Kenneth smiled despite himself. Family. When had he last been part of something that felt like family? "I'll be there," he typed back. And for the first time in 8 years, Kenneth Bowen began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he deserved to live again. Kenneth's first day at the VA clinic arrived with a mix of anticipation and dread. He stood in the parking lot for 10 minutes, gripping the steering wheel, reminding himself he could do this. He'd done harder things, saved lives under fire. This was just medicine in a quiet office setting, except it wasn't just medicine. It was stepping back into the identity he'd abandoned, admitting that maybe Lorraine and Geneva and even Adrienne had been right, that he couldn't run from who he was forever. Geneva met him at the entrance, her welcome both professional and warm. "Ready?" "As I'll ever be," Kenneth said. The morning started slowly. Geneva paired him with a counselor named Theodore Grant, a man in his early 50s with gentle eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent decades listening to difficult stories. Theodore ran group sessions for veterans dealing with grief, trauma, and the challenges of reintegration. "I thought you might benefit from observing today," Geneva had said. "Before you start clinical work, it helps to understand the full scope of what our patients are dealing with." Kenneth sat in the back of the room as 8 veterans gathered for their weekly session. Ages ranged from late 20s to 70s, representing different eras of service, different wars, different wounds. But the common thread was clear. They all carried something heavy, something that made civilian life feel foreign and difficult. One man, probably in his 40s, spoke about the nightmares that hadn't stopped in 5 years. Another talked about feeling invisible to his own family. A woman in her 30s described the guilt of surviving when her unit hadn't. Kenneth listened, and with each story, he recognized pieces of himself. The isolation, the survivor's guilt, the sense that the person who came home wasn't quite the same person who'd left. During a break, Theodore pulled Kenneth aside. "Tough to hear, isn't it?" "Familiar," Kenneth admitted. "Geneva mentioned you might benefit from attending these sessions yourself," Theodore said carefully. Not as an observer, as a participant. Kenneth's first instinct was to refuse. But something about the rawness of what he'd just witnessed, the honesty of those veterans sharing their pain, made him pause. "Maybe," he said. "Let me think about it." After the session, Kenneth began his clinical work. His first patient was a veteran named Paulette Chen, 22 years old, recently discharged after 4 years in the Army. She'd injured her shoulder during training and was dealing with chronic pain that made it difficult to sleep. Kenneth examined her shoulder with practiced efficiency, noting the limited range of motion, the tension in the surrounding muscles. As he worked, Paulette talked about her struggles finding purpose after service, about feeling adrift in civilian life, about considering pre-med but doubting she was capable. "You're more capable than you think," Kenneth said, showing her exercises to improve her mobility. "The discipline you learned in service, that translates to medicine." "Trust me, were you military?" Paulette asked. "Army medic. 12 years, and now you're here helping people like me." She smiled slightly. Guess there's hope after all. After she left, Kenneth sat alone in the examination room, feeling something unfamiliar. Satisfaction. He'd helped someone, not just with her physical injury, but with her confidence. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Over the next 2 weeks, Kenneth fell into a rhythm. Tuesday and Thursday evenings he worked at the college. Wednesday and Friday afternoons he worked at the clinic. Saturday dinners at Lorraine's house became a regular occurrence, and Kenneth found himself looking forward to them. To Lorraine's wisdom, to Adrian's persistent friendliness, to the warmth of belonging somewhere. He also began attending Theodore's group sessions, not as an observer, but as a participant. The first time he spoke about Sandra and his daughter, the words felt like broken glass. But the other veterans understood in a way most people couldn't. They didn't offer platitudes or try to fix him. They just listened, and somehow that was enough. One Saturday evening after dinner at Lorraine's, Adrian asked if she could talk to him privately. They stood on the back porch, the autumn air cool against their skin. "I need to tell you something," Adrian said, and there was nervousness in her voice. "I'm a journalist, Kenneth. I told you that before. But what I didn't tell you is that I've been working on a story." Kenneth felt his guard going up immediately. "About me? No, about what happened to my mom." "The attack!" Adrian pulled out her phone, showing him notes and research. "The police haven't made any arrests. The investigation has gone cold. But I've been digging, and I think there's more to this than a random robbery." "What do you mean?" "There have been 5 similar attacks in the past 3 months, all targeting people living alone, mostly older residents. The level of violence is escalating. My mom was lucky. She survived. The attack 2 weeks before hers, the victim is still in a coma." Adrian's expression was intense, driven. "I think we're dealing with an organized group, and I think they're planning to strike again." Kenneth studied the information on her phone, his tactical mind automatically processing patterns, details. "Have you shared this with the police?" "I tried. They said they're aware of the pattern, but lack the resources to do much beyond standard patrols." Frustration edged her voice. "Meanwhile, people are getting hurt. So what are you going to do?" "Write about it. Expose the pattern. Pressure the authorities to take it seriously." She looked at him. "But I wanted you to know first. Because my mom, she's still nervous, especially at night. And I thought..." "You thought I might have insights," Kenneth finished. "You were military. Combat trained. You see things other people don't." Adrian hesitated. "When you were treating my mom that night, you mentioned things. Details about the attack pattern, the type of injuries. You were analyzing it even then, weren't you?" Kenneth had been, though he hadn't realized it consciously. The tactical thinking, the threat assessment, those instincts didn't just shut off. There was something odd about it, he admitted. The level of violence seemed disproportionate to the crime. Robberies are usually quick, grab what you can and run. But this felt personal, Adrian suggested. "Practiced," Kenneth corrected. Like they knew what they were doing, like they'd done it before. They stood in silence for a moment, both processing the implications. "I'm going to keep investigating," Adrian said finally. "But Kenneth, if you notice anything, if your instincts tell you something's wrong, I'll let you know," he said. Inside, Lorraine had made coffee. They sat around the kitchen table, and the conversation drifted to lighter topics. Lorraine's garden plans for spring, a book Adrian was reading, Kenneth's work at the clinic. But underneath the normalcy, Kenneth felt a familiar tension building, the sense that something was coming. Later that week, Kenneth was cleaning Professor Althea's floor when she emerged from her office looking troubled. "Kenneth, can I ask you something?" "Of course. This is going to sound paranoid, but I think someone's been watching my house." Althea wrapped her arms around herself. "Nothing concrete, just a feeling. A car I don't recognize parked on my street for hours. The sense that someone's been in my yard when I'm not home. My neighbor mentioned seeing someone near my windows last week." Kenneth felt ice slide down his spine. "Have you called the police?" "And tell them what?" "That I have a feeling." Althea shook her head. "They'd think I'm overreacting." "You're not overreacting." Kenneth kept his voice calm. "Where do you live?" Althea gave him her address. Kenneth recognized the neighborhood, quiet, older homes, residents who lived alone. It fit the pattern Adrian had described. "Professor, I need you to be very careful. Lock your doors and windows. If you see anything suspicious, call the police immediately." And he hesitated, then pulled out his phone. "Give me your number. If you feel unsafe at any time, call me." "Kenneth, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering." He met her eyes. "Trust me on this." After she left, Kenneth stood in the empty hallway, his mind racing. He pulled out his phone and called Adrienne. "I need to see all your research on those attacks," he said when she answered. "Tonight, if possible." "Why?" "What happened?" "Professor Althea Drummond. She lives alone. She's been feeling watched." "Her address fits the pattern you described." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "I'll be at the college in 20 minutes. Meet me in the parking lot." When she arrived, Adrian had printed everything: attack reports, victim profiles, timeline analysis. Kenneth spread it across the hood of her car, studying it under the parking lot lights. "Here," he said, pointing to details others had missed. "Look at the injury patterns. These aren't random beatings. There's precision here. Controlled violence designed to incapacitate quickly. And the entry points," he traced the timeline. "Every attack happens between 9 and 11 p.m., always through a rear entrance. Always on weeknights when neighbors are less likely to be outside." "You see it too," Adrian said. "This is more than opportunistic robbery. This is methodical, planned." Kenneth felt something clicking into place in his mind, old training reasserting itself. And if Professor Althea is being watched, she could be next. Kenneth looked at the spread of information, at the pattern of escalating violence, and felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He'd spent 8 years trying to avoid exactly this, the burden of other people's safety, the risk of failing to protect them. But running wasn't an option anymore. These were people he knew, people who'd shown him kindness. Lorraine, who'd welcomed him into her home. Althea, who'd always treated him with respect. Adrienne, who'd refused to let him hide. "I need to make some calls," Kenneth said. "And I need to see the police reports if you can get them." "I can get them," Adrienne said. "But Kenneth, what are you thinking?" He looked at her, seeing the determination in her eyes that matched what he was feeling. "I'm thinking we need to stop these people before someone else gets hurt." What Kenneth didn't know yet was that stopping them would require him to become someone he'd thought was dead, the tactical, strategic operator he'd been in the military. And that journey back to his full self would force him to confront not just external threats, but the final barriers around his wounded heart. Detective Burton was a man in his late 40s, with tired eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd seen too much but still cared enough to do the work. He sat across from Kenneth and Adrienne in a small conference room at the police station, reviewing the materials they'd brought. "I'll admit, you've connected some dots we hadn't," Burton said, studying Adrian's timeline. "We knew about the pattern, but we've been stretched thin. Budget cuts, staff shortages, the usual excuses." He looked at Kenneth. "Miss Foster mentioned you have military experience." "Combat medic?" 12 years Army," Kenneth confirmed. "And you treated Mrs. Foster at the scene." The paramedics were impressed. Burton leaned back in his chair. "I'm going to level with you both." "We got a break in the case this morning. Pawnshop owner recognized some jewelry from one of the robberies. Security footage shows the guy who brought it in. He pulled up an image on his laptop. Grainy security camera footage showing a man in his 30s, wearing a baseball cap, trying to sell items that match the description from one of the attacks. Kenneth leaned forward to study the image, and his blood ran cold. He knew that face. Something wrong? Burton asked, noticing Kenneth's reaction. Kenneth's mind was racing, memories flooding back. The distinctive scar on the man's left cheek. The way he held his shoulders, military posture poorly disguised. Kenneth had served with this man, not closely, but they'd been at the same forward operating base for 6 months. His name is Dominic Voss, Kenneth said quietly. We served together. He was discharged, dishonorably, if I remember correctly. Theft and assault charges. Burton's expression sharpened. You're certain? Positive. Kenneth felt sick. I haven't seen him in probably 10 years, but I remember him. He was troubled, had problems with authority, with impulse control. Some of us thought he might have undiagnosed PTSD, but he refused treatment. Do you know where he might be now? Kenneth shook his head. We weren't friends. I just remember he was from somewhere in the region, Pennsylvania maybe. He talked about coming back here after service. Burton made notes quickly. This is good. This gives us a starting point for identification and background. He looked at Kenneth with new interest. You said theft charges during service. He was caught stealing from supply, and there was an incident with a local contractor, some kind of confrontation that turned violent. The army pushed him out after that, so he has a pattern of theft and escalating violence. Burton pulled up another file. We've been theorizing this is more than one person. The attacks are too coordinated, too well planned for a solo operator. If Voss is involved, he might be running a crew. Adrian spoke up. What about protection for potential targets? Professor Drummond and others who fit the profile. We'll increase patrols in the targeted neighborhoods, but I can't provide individual protection without more concrete threats. Burton's frustration was evident. I hate that answer, but it's the reality of our resources. Kenneth felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on him. Then we'll have to improvise. Be very careful how you finish that sentence, Burton warned. I appreciate civilian vigilance, but I can't have people taking the law into their own hands. I'm not talking about vigilantism, Kenneth said. I'm talking about community awareness, neighborhood watch, communication networks, basic preparedness, things that help people protect themselves while your department does its job. Burton studied him for a long moment. You're not just a medic, are you? You've got tactical training. Some, Kenneth admitted. Enough to understand defensive positioning and threat assessment. All right, Burton made a decision. Here's what I can do. I'll share the basic profile of potential targets with you, not names, just the demographics and neighborhood information. You help organize community awareness in those areas, and we'll coordinate. If you see anything suspicious, you call it in immediately. No heroics. Understood? Understood, Kenneth said, though both he and Burton knew that if it came down to it, Kenneth wouldn't stand by and let someone get hurt. As they left the police station, Adrian turned to Kenneth. You served with this man. Dominic Voss. What else do you remember about him? Kenneth was quiet, pulling up memories he'd rather have left buried. He was smart, tactical, good at reading situations and exploiting weaknesses. But he was also angry, the kind of anger that never quite goes away. After the army pushed him out, I imagine that anger only grew. You think he's targeting military families specifically? Adrian asked. The thought had already occurred to Kenneth. Lorraine's husband was a veteran. If the other victims have military connections, then this isn't just about money, Adrian finished. It's personal. They spent the rest of the day researching the other victims. By evening, the pattern was undeniable. 4 of the 5 victims had direct military connections, veterans themselves or family members of veterans. Professor Althea's brother had served in the army, something Kenneth learned from her personnel file that Adrienne accessed through careful inquiry. He's targeting the military community, Kenneth said, staring at the evidence spread across Lorraine's kitchen table. They'd gathered there after Kenneth's shift at the college, him, Adrian, Lorraine, and now Virgil, whom Kenneth had pulled in because of his steady nature and willingness to help. But why? Lorraine asked. What does he gain from that? Revenge, Kenneth said, or his twisted version of it. He was dishonorably discharged, probably feels the military betrayed him. Now he's making people connected to that world suffer. Virgil, who'd been quietly absorbing everything, spoke up. So what do we do? Kenneth looked around the table at these people who'd become, somehow, his people. Lorraine, who'd given him back the possibility of family. Adrienne, who'd refused to let him hide. Virgil, who'd offered friendship without expectation. They were looking at him for answers, for leadership, and Kenneth realized with startling clarity that he was ready to provide it. We protect our community, he said. Detective Burton is working the official investigation, but we can do things the police can't. We can organize the neighborhoods, create communication networks, teach people how to secure their homes and recognize threats. And we can watch over Professor Althea and others who fit the target profile. That's a lot of ground to cover, Virgil said. Then we'll need more people. Kenneth pulled out a notepad and started making lists, his military training taking over. Virgil, you know the campus security team. Can you recruit a few reliable people for evening patrols around faculty housing? Consider it done. Adrian, your journalism contacts. Can you get the word out about community safety meetings without causing panic? I can frame it as general awareness, she said. Crime prevention education. Lorraine, you know people in the neighborhood association. We need meeting space and volunteers willing to help organize. I'll make calls tomorrow, Lorraine said, and there was fire in her eyes. This woman who'd been victimized was ready to fight back. Kenneth continued planning, identifying resources, creating a defensive strategy. It felt natural in a way nothing had felt in years. This synthesis of his medical knowledge, his military training, his understanding of how to protect people. This was what he'd been trained for, even if the setting was different than the combat zones he'd known. Kenneth, Adrian said quietly as the others discussed logistics. Are you sure about this? Going after someone you know, someone from your past? I'm sure, Kenneth said. Dominic Voss understands violence and exploitation. What he doesn't understand is community, people coming together to protect each other. That's our advantage. Over the next few days, Kenneth transformed from a quiet janitor into a tactical coordinator. He met with neighborhood groups, teaching basic security awareness. He worked with Virgil to establish patrol routes around vulnerable areas. He trained volunteers in what to look for, what to report, how to stay safe while remaining vigilant. Geneva noticed the change in him at the clinic. You're different, she said one afternoon. More present, more yourself. I found something worth fighting for, Kenneth said simply. Professor Althea was initially resistant to special attention, but when Kenneth explained the full scope of the threat, she agreed to extra precautions. He installed additional locks on her doors, motion sensor lights in her yard, and gave her his personal number with instructions to call at any sign of trouble. Why are you doing all this? Althea asked as Kenneth finished installing the last sensor. Because I spent 8 years being useless, Kenneth said. I'm done with that. Late one evening, as Kenneth was coordinating with Virgil about the next shift rotation, his phone rang. Detective Burton, we've identified 2 other members of Voss's crew, Burton said without preamble. Small-time criminals with records of assault and burglary. We're putting out warrants. But Kenneth, we got intelligence that suggests they're planning something big. Multiple targets within the next week? Kenneth's pulse quickened. Do you know which targets? Not specifically, but the intelligence suggests they're aware we're onto them, and they're planning one last major operation before they disappear. After hanging up, Kenneth stood in the empty hallway of the college, feeling the weight of what was coming. Dominic Voss was escalating, and Kenneth knew from experience that cornered predators were the most dangerous. He called Adrian. Gather everyone. We need to meet tonight. Things are about to get serious. As he waited for the others to arrive, Kenneth looked at his reflection in the darkened window. The man staring back wasn't the broken janitor who'd been hiding for 8 years. He was the combat medic, the tactical operator, the protector he'd once been. The past and present had finally merged, and Kenneth discovered something surprising. He was ready for this, ready to use everything he'd learned, everyone he'd been, to protect the people who'd given him back his life. Dominic Voss had chosen the wrong community to target, and he'd made an even bigger mistake. He'd forgotten that some soldiers never stop being soldiers, even when they're pushing a mop. The war was coming to Riverside, and Kenneth Bowen was done running from it. Kenneth's apartment had transformed into a command center. Maps covered his kitchen table, marked with colored pins indicating vulnerable homes, patrol routes, and observation points. His old tactical radio headset sat charging on the counter, equipment he'd retrieved from storage after a decade of disuse. The shoebox that once held his medals now lay empty, its contents finally displayed on his shelf where they belonged. It was 3 a.m, but sleep was impossible. Kenneth studied the map, his mind running through scenarios, contingencies, weak points in their defense. 12 potential targets based on the pattern. His volunteer network could effectively monitor 8 of them. That left 4 households vulnerable, including Professor Althea's. His phone buzzed. "Adrian, can't sleep either." Her text read, "Too much to think about," he replied. "Coffee at Lorraine's in 20 minutes. Kenneth grabbed his jacket. When he arrived, he found not just Adrienne and Lorraine, but Virgil, Geneva, and Theodore as well. Lorraine had clearly been up for hours, coffee already brewed, notepads organized on the table. "Couldn't sleep knowing you were out here planning alone," Lorraine said, pouring him a cup. "We're a team now. We plan together." Kenneth felt something warm settle in his chest, gratitude mixed with the unfamiliar sensation of belonging. "All right, let's go through everything." He spread out the maps and patrol schedules he'd created. Virgil had recruited 5 reliable security personnel from the college, willing to volunteer during off hours. Geneva brought medical supplies and had arranged for an emergency response protocol at the clinic. Theodore offered his counseling space as a coordination center, since it had multiple phone lines and internet access. "Detective Burton gave me updated intelligence," Kenneth said, pointing to the map. "Voss and his crew are planning to move within 48 hours. They know we're organizing and they're getting nervous. Nervous criminals make mistakes, but they're also more dangerous." "Do we know their target?" Virgil asked, Burton's best guess based on their previous pattern is they'll hit 3 or 4 houses in quick succession, maximize their take before law enforcement can respond effectively. Kenneth circled the 4 most vulnerable locations. "These are our gaps in coverage. I've been trying to figure out how to protect them all." "We split up," Adrian said. "Station someone at each location." "Too risky," Kenneth said. "If something goes wrong, backup won't arrive in time. We need concentration of force, not dispersion." Geneva leaned forward, studying the map. "Which one is most likely?" Kenneth's finger landed on one address. "Professor Althea. She lives alone, she's been observed, and she fits the profile perfectly. If I were planning this operation, she'd be a primary target." "Then we focus there," Lorraine said with finality. "The police can patrol the others, but we make sure Althea is protected." Over the next 2 days, Kenneth orchestrated preparations with military precision. He briefed Professor Althea thoroughly, ensuring she understood the situation without causing panic. She was remarkably calm, perhaps drawing strength from the community rallying around her. "I spent 30 years teaching literature," Althea told Kenneth as he reviewed security procedures with her. "I've analyzed countless stories about courage and community. It's humbling to be living one." Kenneth installed additional security measures at her home, reinforced locks, a panic button connected directly to his phone, clear sightlines from windows. He mapped escape routes and safe rooms. Virgil provided her with a radio tuned to their coordination frequency. The surveillance team rotated in 8-hour shifts. Volunteers parked discreetly on adjacent streets, maintaining visual contact with Althea's house. Kenneth coordinated everything from Theodore's office, which had become their operational headquarters. Detective Burton stopped by on the second evening, reviewing their setup with a critical eye. "I should probably tell you this is crazy," he said. "But honestly, it's more organized than some official operations I've seen." "You sure you were just a medic, Bowen?" "Combat medics receive tactical training," Kenneth said. "We often operated in small teams, independent of larger units. You learn to plan, adapt, improvise. Well, your improvisation might actually work." Burton pointed to the radio equipment. "My people are coordinating with yours. If anything happens, we'll have units staged nearby." "But Kenneth, these men are dangerous. If they show up, your job is to delay and observe, not engage." "Understood." "Understood," Kenneth said, though they both knew the reality might be different. That evening, Kenneth visited his daughter's grave for the first time in 3 years. He stood before the simple headstone, reading her name, feeling the familiar ache of loss. But underneath it was something new: purpose, determination. The sense that he was finally honoring her memory by being the man she'd believed he was. "I'm doing something that matters," he said quietly. "Protecting people, using what I learned. I think you'd be proud of that." He paused, then added, "I'm proud of it too. Took me a while to get here, but I made it." The wind rustled through the trees, and Kenneth felt, perhaps for the first time since her death, a sense of peace. Not the absence of grief, but peace alongside it, the ability to carry the loss without being crushed by it. Back at the coordination center, the team gathered for a final briefing. Kenneth stood before the map, looking at the faces around him. Lorraine, whose survival had started this entire chain of events. Adrienne, whose refusal to let him hide had forced him back into life. Virgil, whose quiet friendship had sustained him through transition. Geneva and Theodore, who'd given him back his healing purpose. "Thank you," Kenneth said simply. "For everything. For seeing me when I was trying to be invisible. For not letting me stay buried. Whatever happens tonight or tomorrow, I want you to know you gave me back my life. We just reminded you it was still there," Lorraine said. "You did the hard work of coming back." The first night passed without incident. Kenneth dozed fitfully in Theodore's office, the radio beside him, ready to respond at any moment. The second day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every car that passed Althea's street was noted and logged, every shadow analyzed and dismissed. By the second evening, Kenneth's nerves were stretched thin. He stood outside the office, breathing the cool autumn air, when his phone rang. "Detective Burton, we just got a tip from an informant," Burton said, his voice tight. "Voss is moving tonight. Multiple targets, starting around 11 p.m. We're mobilizing everything we have, but Kenneth, your position is the most likely first hit. Be ready." Kenneth's training took over, pushing aside fear and doubt. "We're ready." He gathered the team and delivered the news with calm authority. "This is it. Everyone knows their positions and responsibilities. Stay alert, stay safe, and remember, our goal is to protect and observe. Let the police handle the arrests." As darkness fell, Kenneth took his position in a car half a block from Althea's house. He could see her living room window, could see her shadow moving inside as she went about her evening routine with practiced normalcy. Virgil was stationed on the opposite side of the street. 2 other volunteers covered the rear approaches. Kenneth retrieved his old combat radio headset from his bag, dusty but functional. He fitted it over his ears, adjusted the microphone, and felt a strange sense of completeness. This was who he was: healer and protector, caretaker and guardian. His phone buzzed. A text from Adrienne, who was stationed at the coordination center with Theodore. "Stay safe. Come back whole." Kenneth smiled despite the tension. "Always do," he replied. The clock showed 10:47 p.m., 13 minutes until Burton's estimated timeline. Kenneth's hands were steady on the steering wheel, his breathing controlled and measured. He'd done this before, waited in the darkness for threats to emerge, prepared to respond with everything he had. The difference was that 8 years ago he'd been running from this life. Tonight, he was running toward it, fully present and fully committed. His radio crackled. Virgil's voice, calm and clear. "Movement on the south side. Vehicle approaching, no headlights." Kenneth's heart rate increased, but his mind remained clear. "Copy that. All units, we have a possible hostile approach. Maintain positions. Burton, you copy? Copy, came the detective's voice. Units are 3 minutes out. Do not engage. Through the darkness, Kenneth saw the vehicle, a dark sedan rolling slowly down the street, predatory and deliberate. It stopped 3 houses away from Althea's. 3 men emerged, even from this distance, even in the darkness. Kenneth recognized Dominic Voss's distinctive posture. Confirmed visual on Voss, Kenneth reported quietly. 3 subjects heading toward the target house. This was it. Everything had been building to this moment. Years of hiding, weeks of preparation, hours of waiting. Kenneth's hand moved to the door handle, ready to step into the confrontation he'd been avoiding and preparing for simultaneously. The past and present had finally converged, and Kenneth Bowen was exactly where he needed to be. Kenneth exited his vehicle silently, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. The 3 men were advancing toward Althea's house, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Dominic Voss led the group, while his 2 associates flanked him on either side. 2 minutes out, Burton's voice crackled through the radio. Do not engage, but 2 minutes might as well be forever. Kenneth could see the men reaching the side gate, preparing to breach Althea's property. He couldn't wait, wouldn't wait, not when someone under his protection was in immediate danger. He moved quickly across the street, his footsteps silent on the pavement. Years of tactical training flooded back, approach angles, positioning, threat assessment. He placed himself between the intruders and Althea's back door, stepping into the dim light of her porch. That's far enough, Kenneth said, his voice carrying authority that seemed to come from somewhere deep and certain. The 3 men froze. Dominic Voss turned slowly, and even in the darkness, Kenneth could see the recognition dawn on his face. Bowen. Dominic's voice held genuine surprise. Kenneth Bowen, what are you doing here? Protecting someone you don't get to hurt. Dominic laughed, but there was an edge to it. You're supposed to be broken, man. Last I heard, you lost everything and disappeared. What are you now, playing hero for these people? I'm exactly what I always was, Kenneth said calmly. Someone who stops people like you, people like me. Dominic's voice hardened. You mean people the army chewed up and spit out? People who gave everything and got nothing back? We're the same, Bowen. Both of us got screwed by the system. We're nothing alike. Kenneth kept his eyes on all 3 men, tracking their positions. You're hurting innocent people, taking from them, terrorizing them. That's not the system failing you. That's you failing yourself. One of Dominic's associates, a younger man with nervous energy, shifted his weight. Dom, this is taking too long. Let's just shut up, Dominic snapped. Then to Kenneth, you really want to do this? You're 1 guy, unarmed, against 3 of us. Smart money says you move aside. Smart money would be wrong. Kenneth's stance remained relaxed but ready. You've got about 90 seconds before police arrive. You can leave now and maybe get away, or you can try to get past me and guarantee you don't. Behind him, Kenneth heard Althea's door lock click. She was securing herself inside, following the protocol they'd established. Good. Virgil's voice came through his earpiece, quiet but urgent. Kenneth, I'm moving to your position. 30 seconds. Dominic studied Kenneth for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, calculation giving way to anger. You think you're better than me. You think because you're helping these people, you're somehow redeemed. We both know you're just as broken as I am. Maybe, Kenneth acknowledged. But I'm choosing to do something about it that doesn't involve hurting people who've done nothing wrong. The nervous associate moved suddenly, lunging toward the side of the house. Kenneth reacted instantly, intercepting him with a precise movement that sent the man stumbling backward. The combat training was still there, muscle memory taking over. Don't, Kenneth warned. The second associate, larger and more confident, stepped forward. You just made a mistake, old man. He swung hard, but Kenneth had been reading the tell in his shoulders. He ducked under the punch and delivered a controlled strike to the man's solar plexus, enough to drop him to his knees, gasping for air, but not enough to cause lasting damage. Even now, even in this moment, Kenneth's instinct was to disable without destroying, Dominic watched his associate go down, his expression darkening. "Guess you're not as rusty as I thought. Police are here!" Virgil's shout came from across the yard as sirens wailed in the distance, growing rapidly louder. The nervous associate was already running. The larger one staggered to his feet and followed, clutching his chest. But Dominic didn't move. He stood facing Kenneth, and in his eyes was something complicated. Rage, yes, but also something that looked almost like respect. "This isn't over, Bowen." "Yes, it is," Kenneth said firmly. "You're done hurting people in this community. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly. You're angry at the world, at how things turned out." "I get it, Dominic. I've been there. But this?" Kenneth gestured to the house behind him, to the neighborhood, to everything Dominic had terrorized. "This isn't the answer. This just makes you the thing you hate." Police cars screeched to a halt on the street, officers emerging with weapons drawn. Detective Burton's voice boomed through a loudspeaker, ordering everyone to freeze. Dominic looked at the police, then back at Kenneth. For a moment, something flickered across his face, regret perhaps, or the ghost of the soldier he'd once been. "I could have been great," Dominic said quietly. "You still could be," Kenneth replied. "But not like this. Never like this." Detective Burton and 3 officers moved in, weapons trained on Dominic. "On the ground now!" Dominic slowly raised his hands, then dropped to his knees. As the officers moved to cuff him, he looked up at Kenneth one last time. "How did you do it, Bowen? How did you come back from being broken?" Kenneth thought about Lorraine, about Adrienne, about all the people who'd refused to let him stay hidden, about the choice he'd made to step back into life, to use his gifts instead of burying them. "I let people help me," Kenneth said. "And then I helped them back." Dominic was hauled to his feet and led away. The other 2 associates had been caught trying to flee and were being arrested on the next block. It was over. Kenneth stood in Althea's yard, breathing hard, his hands trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. Virgil appeared beside him, solid and steady. "You all right?" Virgil asked. "Yeah," Kenneth said. "Yeah, I am." Professor Althea opened her door cautiously. When she saw Kenneth standing there, safe and whole, tears filled her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. Kenneth nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in his throat. He'd done it. Protected someone who mattered. Used his skills for something good. Become, finally, the person he'd thought he'd lost forever. The police station was chaos, officers processing arrests, witnesses giving statements. Detective Burton coordinating everything with the controlled urgency of someone who knew they'd just closed a major case. Kenneth sat in a plastic chair in the hallway, a bandage on his left forearm where he'd scraped it during the confrontation. Watching the organized chaos unfold around him, Adrienne burst through the doors, Lorraine close behind her. They rushed to Kenneth, Adrienne's hands immediately checking him over for injuries. "I'm fine," Kenneth said, catching her hands gently. "Just a scratch." "You said you wouldn't engage," Adrienne said, and there was fear beneath the anger in her voice. "You promised you'd just observe." "I couldn't let them hurt her." Kenneth met her eyes. "You know I couldn't." Lorraine sat down beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Of course you couldn't. That's who you are, Kenneth. We just wish you didn't have to risk yourself." "Part of the job," Kenneth said with a slight smile. Detective Burton emerged from an interrogation room, looking tired but satisfied. "Bowen, got a minute?" Kenneth followed him into a small office. Burton gestured for him to sit, then leaned against the desk. "Dominic Voss is talking," Burton said. "Trying to cut a deal, naming his associates, giving us details on the other robberies. We'll have solid cases against all 3 of them," he paused. "He also said something interesting about you." "What's that?" "He said you were one of the best medics he'd ever seen. Said back in the service, guys would ask for you specifically if they got hurt, because they knew you'd bring them through." Burton studied Kenneth carefully. "He also said losing your family destroyed you. That you became a ghost after that." Kenneth said nothing. "But tonight," Burton continued, "you weren't a ghost. You were tactical, precise, in complete control. You de-escalated a dangerous situation and protected a civilian without anyone getting seriously hurt. That's not ghost behavior. That's someone who's found their way back. I had help, Kenneth said quietly. We all need help sometimes. Burton extended his hand. Thank you for what you did tonight. Officially, I have to tell you that civilian intervention is dangerous and not recommended. Unofficially, you saved that woman's life and helped us close a case that's been plaguing this community for months. Kenneth shook his hand. Just glad it's over, is it? Burton asked. Over for you, I mean? You going back to pushing a mop after this? Kenneth considered the question. I don't know yet. But I'm not hiding anymore. That much I know. Outside the police station, the night air was cold and clean. Kenneth stood on the steps with Adrian and Lorraine, watching the last of the police vehicles depart. Virgil had gone home an hour ago, exhausted but satisfied. Geneva and Theodore were closing down the coordination center. Come home with us, Lorraine said. No one should be alone after a night like this. Kenneth almost declined out of habit, but caught himself. All right, thank you. At Lorraine's house, they sat around the kitchen table with hot coffee and the comfortable silence of people who'd been through something significant together. Adrian kept glancing at Kenneth, as if reassuring herself he was really there and really safe. What Dominic said, Kenneth finally spoke, about me being broken. He wasn't entirely wrong. Past tense, Adrian said firmly. You were broken. But you're not anymore. I'm still broken in places, Kenneth admitted. I'll always carry what I lost. But I think... He paused, searching for the right words. I think I've finally learned that being broken doesn't mean being useless. That you can heal around the cracks and still be whole enough to matter. Lorraine reached across the table and squeezed his hand. You matter, Kenneth. You've always mattered. Some of us just had to wait for you to believe it yourself. Later, as Kenneth prepared to leave, Adrian walked him to his car. I was terrified tonight, she said. When I heard you'd confronted them, when I thought... Her voice caught. I've gotten used to having you around, Kenneth. Don't make me lose that. Kenneth looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something he'd been too closed off to recognize before. She cared about him. Not as a story, not as a project, but as a person who mattered to her. I'm not going anywhere, he said softly. Not anymore. She hugged him then, fierce and tight, and Kenneth hugged her back, feeling the walls around his heart finally, fully crumbling. Get some rest, she said when they separated. Tomorrow we figure out what comes next. Tomorrow. Kenneth agreed. He drove home through quiet streets, past the college where his mop and bucket waited, past the clinic where his next shift would be. His apartment, when he entered it, no longer felt like a hiding place. The photo of his family on the nightstand smiled at him in the darkness. I did it, he whispered to them. I came back. I'm sorry it took so long, but I finally came back. He retrieved his old combat medic patch from the drawer, the one he'd carried in his pocket during the confrontation. It was worn and faded, but still recognizable. A reminder of who he'd been, who he was becoming. Kenneth placed it on the shelf beside his medals, beside the photo, beside all the pieces of himself he'd finally brought back into the light. He was a combat medic, a janitor, a volunteer at the VA clinic, a friend, a protector. All of it all at once, no longer divided or hidden. He was Kenneth Bowen. And for the first time in 8 years, that was enough. 3 months had passed since that night. And Riverside Community College looked different in the spring sunshine. Students sprawled on the lawn between classes. Professors lingered in doorways chatting. And the campus felt alive with the kind of energy that comes when winter finally releases its grip. Kenneth pushed his cleaning cart down the third-floor hallway, but the cart looked different now. Alongside the mop and supplies sat a first aid kit, a proper one, well-stocked and regularly updated. His uniform shirt bore a new patch, Campus Safety and Medical Coordinator. Dean Prescott had offered him the dual position after the arrest of Dominic Voss made the news. Kenneth worked 3 evenings a week as a janitor, his choice because he'd come to appreciate the meditative quality of the work, and 3 afternoons teaching first aid courses to students and staff. It was a strange combination, but it suited him perfectly. Mr. Bowen, a student, waved from down the hall. Thanks again for last week's CPR training. My roommate actually used it this weekend when someone choked at a restaurant. Kenneth smiled. Glad it helped. That's why we practice. The student hurried off, and Kenneth continued his rounds. Professor Althea emerged from her office carrying a stack of books. Kenneth, perfect timing. I wanted to invite you to our department's end-of-semester gathering next week. It's casual, just faculty and some special guests. I'd like you to be there. Special guests? Kenneth asked. People who've made a difference to our community this year. Althea's smile was warm. That includes you. Kenneth had learned to accept gratitude without deflecting it, though it still felt uncomfortable sometimes. I'd be honored. His phone buzzed. A text from Geneva. Don't forget, clinic at 2. We have 4 new patients scheduled. Kenneth had expanded his work at the VA clinic to 3 days a week. He'd found his calling there, working with veterans who understood what it meant to carry invisible wounds. He'd also started co-leading Theodore's grief counseling group, sharing his own story of loss and recovery with others who were struggling to find their way back. The healing went both ways. Every veteran Kenneth helped was a small redemption, a way of honoring the lives he'd saved and the ones he hadn't been able to save. His daughter would never grow up. His wife would never grow old beside him, but their memory pushed him forward now, instead of holding him back. At lunchtime, Kenneth met Adrienne at a cafe near campus. She'd been working on a follow-up story about community safety initiatives, but their relationship had evolved far beyond professional courtesy. They'd been dating for 2 months now, slowly, carefully, both of them navigating the terrain of opening up after years of protecting their hearts. Mom wants to know if you're coming to Sunday dinner, Adrienne said, sliding into the booth across from him. Would I miss it? Kenneth had become a regular fixture at Lorraine's table, and the older woman had essentially adopted him as the son she'd never had. The 3 of them had formed an unlikely family, bound together by trauma and healing in equal measure. She's making pot roast. Fair warning, she's been asking me when we're getting serious. Adrienne's tone was light, but Kenneth caught the question underneath. Are we? He asked, getting serious. Adrienne met his eyes. I think we already are. The question is whether we're ready to admit it. Kenneth thought about the life he'd built over these past months, the work that mattered, the friendships that sustained him, the woman sitting across from him who'd refused to let him hide and had somehow become essential to his daily existence. I'm ready, he said. If you are, her smile answered before her words did. I've been ready for a while, just waiting for you to catch up. That evening, Kenneth stood alone in the hallway where Adrienne had first found him, where everything had changed. The same water fountain, the same worn linoleum, the same fluorescent lights humming overhead. But nothing was the same, really. He pulled out his phone and looked at the photo he'd taken last week. Him, Adrienne, and Lorraine at Sunday dinner, laughing at something Virgil had said. Behind them, slightly out of focus, was the shelf where Kenneth had finally displayed his medals and his family photo, side by side. Past and present, integrated at last. A young maintenance worker walked past, new to the job, pushing his cart with the hunched shoulders of someone trying to be invisible. Kenneth recognized that posture, had worn it himself for 8 years. Evening, Kenneth said, his voice friendly. You're doing good work. Don't let anyone tell you different. The young man looked up, surprised to be acknowledged, and managed a shy smile. Thanks. Kenneth watched him continue down the hall and understood something fundamental. Everyone carried stories. Everyone fought battles others couldn't see. And sometimes the greatest gift you could give someone was simply to see them, really see them, and remind them they mattered. His phone buzzed. Theodore, reminding him about the grief group meeting tomorrow. Geneva, sending him notes on a patient case. Virgil, asking if he wanted to grab coffee before the shift. Adrienne, with a heart emoji and nothing else. Kenneth Bowen had spent 8 years trying to disappear, convinced that being invisible was the same as being safe. But he'd learned the hard truth. Invisibility wasn't safety. It was just another kind of dying, slower and quieter than the kind that came all at once. He'd been given a second chance by Adrienne's desperate plea, by Lorraine's wisdom, by his community's refusal to let him fade away. And he'd taken that chance and built something worth living for. The hallway stretched ahead of him, floors to clean and lives to touch. Kenneth picked up his mop, but he was smiling as he worked, because he finally understood that every role he filled, janitor, medic, teacher, friend, partner, was just a different way of doing the same essential thing: showing up, being present, mattering. Sometimes the people we walk past every day carry stories we'll never fully know. But sometimes, if we're lucky, we get to be part of those stories. We get to witness someone's transformation from broken to whole, from hidden to seen, from lost to found. Kenneth Bowen had been all those things: broken, hidden, lost. But he'd also become their opposites, and in doing so, he'd discovered the truth that had been waiting for him all along. Healing isn't about forgetting what broke you. It's about learning to carry it without letting it define you. It's about stepping back into the light, even when the darkness feels safer. It's about letting people see you, really see you, and trusting that you're worth seeing. Kenneth pushed his mop across the floor, leaving order in his wake, and knew with certainty that he was exactly where he belonged: living, healing, mattering, finally, gloriously, completely alive.